What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review for Fallout 76, roughly 8 years after the fact, as I love to be on time. But in reality, I was just very curious about this game and trying to get a good beat on it, as it is pretty much the only Fallout title, besides maybe Shelter, that I haven't actually played, and so I was curious to jump in and finally get a feel for it after all the years and updates have passed, just to kind of see where it is. Now, this unintentionally kind of coincided with the recent Bethesda announcements. That is genuinely a coincidence. I've been planning this stuff for months, and I'll mention the expansion they announced here in a little while, but obviously, this review is just a review as opposed to a 100%. If it's not exceedingly obvious, that is because this game is a live service title at the end of the day, and the concept of 100% there doesn't really make any sense because there is both content you can no longer see because it's no longer available, but also more yet to come. And so, as a result of that, I basically just played this game for, I think it was about 80 hours total, running through all the major content, getting to the end game, and basically setting myself up to play the expansion when it comes out. And the few things that I am missing are basically grinds and stuff, but in spite of the fact it has been so many years later, I do actually need to inform you that I received a key for the Burning Springs bundle that they released when the Burning Springs update dropped all the way back in December of 2025. At least I think it was December, but roughly 7 months or so ago. And while I did pay for the base game on my own, they gave me that little bundle, which is like an in-store thing that just has some items in it. But still, I am required to, of course, disclose that, just so you're aware. But otherwise, let's get on with the rest of this, starting with a brief overview. Now, I had not played Fallout 76 really much at all since it released, like a couple of hours before this, mostly enough to verify that it was a live service game and not something I was going to take a lot of joy in. And yet, I certainly had that notion challenged while playing through this game. If you watch my first impressions for it, I had a lot of reservations about the way certain things were implemented, the multiplayer aspect, the microtransaction shop, etc. And I'll say this before we dive into specifics. This game was better than I expected. They did some things here that I think are at the very least interesting, even if not all of them landed with me. Just to give one example, I actually really liked the way they changed VATs here, which I did not expect. The VAT system always being a method of course, bridging the gap between the early entries and the more action-oriented entries of the later series. Its exact implementation has always been a little, let's say, contentious, and in this one, being a multiplayer title as it is, basically time doesn't slow down or stop, but rather VATS gives you a % chance to hit the target that you can actually see, as opposed to needing to aim. But the thing is, that actually still solves most of the problem I have with things like feral ghouls, which move in a sort of erratic way that can be hard for me to track, and so I wound up really enjoying that. On the other side of things, the cash shop is mostly irrelevant if you don't want to mess with it. Like, there's some utility stuff for like repair kits and whatnot, but I never found that useful at all. And then the rest of it mainly seems to be like if you really want to get into building up your own camp, which is admittedly not for me, so it was mostly an irrelevant feature, and with the utility tab in particular, I was worried it might sort of infringe on the rest of the game, and in that sense, I think the only thing that really does that is the way they had to change some things to account for the fact that this is a multiplayer title at the end of the day. And I would say that specifically, that part, the things that they had to do in order to make this a multiplayer title are really where this game loses me, and it winds up from going like super interesting and being set in a part of the country that I'm pretty close to being something that I'm still not wild about, which is mainly the way they change things like progression, etc., to set it up for longevity, let's say, to keep people playing. There are some grinds towards the end game, as I've already mentioned, which is where I decided to stop, because I don't really want to do that, as that isn't the kind of thing I want from a Fallout experience personally. But stuff like that is what I'm hoping to dive into here, but beyond that, really all I can tell you is how the game looks these days. I did not play it on launch. I'm not really going to be able to compare it outside of maybe an anecdote or two about what I've heard, but in that sense, all this video really can be is me talking about how I feel about how the game is right now, which puts me in a good position to then, of course, follow up with the Raven Rock expansion that they announced a week or two back. From there, let's get into the more specific things, starting with the technical state of this game. How is it running? And perhaps unsurprisingly, bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, it only crashed on me twice over 80 hours. On the other, I had quite a few problems with various quests here and there. Occasionally, I would be in the middle of a longer quest and like the server maintenance thing would trigger and I would have to leave the world I was currently on because it only gives you a 20-minute timer, and then that quest progress resets on interior cells. For the most part, some of them have checkpoints, but that in particular, though, becomes a bit of an issue. There are quests that only sort of update once you get back out of the interior portion, like the normal dungeon or so that you would explore previously. And so if something happens while you're in there, you're going to have to redo it. And this actually features in quite a few bugs. Like there is a side quest with one of the allies you can pick up, a guy named Beckett. And there's a pretty common bug right at the end of his whole quest line after the end of a fairly long dungeon, that if you pick the wrong option, it just soft locks the quest and you have to do the entire thing over again because when you exit out, it's going to reset it. So that got extremely annoying. On the flip side of that, in the Atlantic City expedition, there's apparently a very long-standing bug where in what I would describe as one of the worst quests I've ever seen, that requires you to take yourself out in order to somehow bypass the check, and this has apparently been known since like at least March. I could find people talking about it. And I ran into the exact same problem and had to bypass it the exact same way because apparently nobody's bothered to even fix that, which, to be fair, at this point with some of the team gutted, hard to say how many resources they have left to do that. So long story short, the technical state of this one leaves a bit to be desired, honestly. And it isn't exactly like the single-player games where you can mod your way around some of those issues. You're kind of just stuck with them. And I will just go on a little bit of a tangent here. I mentioned that the quest that had that Atlantic City bug was one of the worst quests I've ever seen, and I am not exaggerating. I kid you not. They have you go impersonate a clown and then put on a clown show, and that's where this bug happens. And that's about the perfect descriptor for it. The whole thing is a clown show. And that was definitely the low point of the entire review. Thankfully, there were other parts that I enjoyed and things I appreciated, but I don't think I'll be forgetting that particular experience, and not in a good way. Now, from here, I do want to break down the differences between multiplayer, single player, like the shop, kind of just all those general live service-y type features and the general modes of gameplay, which is a little different than what I normally do. But I feel like it's important here because one of the questions I had going into this game was like, how much do you need to interact with other people? I understand that there's not actually that many people on a given world state, so I think it's like 24 at a maximum. So what does that actually look like in terms of gameplay? Well, the answer is the game is divided up between, I would say, several different aspects of it. And like the main one, the thing you can do the most of, is single player exploration and questing. Now, some of the sort of presentation of that has been altered to fit the multiplayer part of it. Like, for instance, progress in interior cells only sort of saving once you finish. But by and large, almost everything can be done solo. There are several things that are definitely much, much easier with other people, like the Scorched Beast Queen fight, and some of the events are just, again, much, much easier with people. And thankfully, on the multiplayer side of things, they actually made that pretty easy to deal with. So I'm pretty multiplayer averse these days. I used to play a lot of MMOs and everything, but it's just not my thing anymore. I don't really want to coordinate with people. I do it very sparingly and honestly kind of avoid it as much as I can. But to be honest, the way multiplayer is implemented here, it does kind of support that approach. So these days there are public teams that can be created. These can be for just casual running around that you can join up and just mess around while in a group, or they can be for specific purposes like clearing public events or doing daily ops, which are like daily missions, and then expeditions, which are like little mini dungeons. And those are very like drop in, drop out. Everybody's usually pretty cool about it. There's like some emotes and stuff to communicate, and it really doesn't put any burden on you, the player, at all. And in that way, the few things that you probably do want a group for can be pretty easily tackled this way. Because they're public, you don't need to like request to join or anything. You just hit the join button and that's all. Very non-committal, if you will. Now, given that this is a live service game and has ongoing updates, but is buy to play, what does the monetization model look like? Well, as many people are, I'm sure, aware, you buy the game. These days, the base game is $40 US, and that comes with all of the free updates. Like, you don't need to buy DLC or anything. And so, the way this game makes money and the way it keeps servers going and pays for those updates is basically two things: the cash shop, as well as the seasons and the Fallout First subscription. So subscribing to Fallout First gets you a bunch of benefits per month. It also allows you to set up a private server or a private world where you can play on your own or just purely with friends without dealing with the drop-in and drop-out nature of things. If you want to play completely by yourself, that is honestly not a bad way to approach it. But I'm really not trying to sign up for a subscription personally, and the part where you're going to probably feel like you might want to is a part that I kind of got a little bit annoyed with in ESO as well, where they basically limit your stash size, and by picking up Fallout First, they remove that limit, which means, of course, they're selling you a solution to a problem that they themselves have created, and I'm never a big fan of that kind of thing, and that's where I think, in particular, monetization like this can start to influence the actual game design that everywhere else in the game, it doesn't really do that. But again, that was mainly an in-game problem. Where I am right now, I still have some stash space left, but that said, I'm not much of a hoarder personally, and I'm pretty close to the point where if I were to continue playing, I would have to start properly managing that if I didn't want to pay for this, which I don't love. Now, another part of this subscription is that they give you some of their in-game currency per month, which are atoms. You can also earn a ton of that for free. I actually bought a couple things I'm about to talk about because they give you so much of it, but most of what you can actually spend it on is cosmetic stuff in the shop that, unless you really care about building up your camp and trying to make that as cool as possible, is otherwise pretty forgettable, because most of the rest of it is utility stuff in the form of repair kits or some convenience items that I never found necessary, to the point where buying them just to bypass the tiniest of inconvenience that dealing with the system is, like repairing, requiring some materials instead of being for free with a repair kit, and the fact that they also give you some of those for free every other day, and you can also get them from doing the Scorch Queen event, left me a little bit surprised that I think the shop is both super unintrusive, mostly cosmetic, and honestly, as a result, mostly, thankfully, forgettable. I still don't love that it's there, personally, but it's pretty unintrusive, which I do appreciate on that front, at least. Now, another aspect to this is seasons. So they have an ongoing season system where you'll earn points simply by playing the game. Mostly, this ranks you up in that season, which then each rank gives you these tickets to spend on in-game rewards. That also seem free, but some of it is tied to Fallout First as well. And speaking for myself, at least, I never felt compelled to really dive down in and try to earn those rewards or something. It was just kind of a nice bonus when I was there, I guess. Now, all of that stuff talked about, let's talk about what I did personally. So one of the things I was really curious about going into this is, what was the new player experience like for somebody jumping in 8 years later after all these updates? And it's a bit of a mixed bag. I will say some of this is self-inflicted, and we'll get to that in a moment. But mostly, I would say the new player experience is not great. I spent probably about 20 or so hours of this experience just trying to get over the basics of the things I felt like I had to do before I could start more let's say, systematically clearing things out. But that 20 hours that I spent doing that is actually with some player boosts. Now, this is a mix of one that they've added to the game for free, and then a paid one as well, which I got also for free from the atoms they give you from doing challenges. So when you leave the vault for the first time, you'll actually be asked if you want to start a level 1 character or a level 20. And I want to point out that the game presents the level 20 option as the recommended one. On my impressions video, I got some people saying that you have to start from 1, and that's how you get an idea of all the progression and everything. And I'm not saying you're wrong, but I am pointing out the game is actively saying the opposite. Now, I played for a few hours previously. This time around, I took that level 20 boost. I played that for a few levels to get the basics out of the way, and then there's actually a secondary boost that you buy for 1500 atoms, which will take you to level 50, which is the end of the main progression, though arguably where the long-term progression really starts, but we'll save that for a little bit from now. Level 50 is the point at which you stop getting special points, start getting legendary perks, and then thinking long-term in terms of what your build actually is. More or less, you've hit the foundation, and now it's about building upwards. Now, this is the part where I do think a little bit of that new player experience was absolutely self-inflicted, and I'm not trying to say that it isn't, because at level 50 a bunch of other stuff becomes available and you kind of get bombarded with quests. But again, I want to point out the game was doing that when I was at level 20 already, which is what they recommend. You step out of the vault, pick the recommended level 20 option, and then it's just quest after quest being thrown in your face, and it can be a little difficult to figure out like what you should be doing when, or like what quest line leads where. And I wound up again spending about 20 or so hours just kind of feeling like I was getting the basics of the experience out of the way before I could actually play the game, which I did not love. Now, I was able to buy that level 50 boost, as I mentioned, because I think the Burning Springs bundle thing they gave me came with some atoms, and then you earn them over time by doing challenges in game, which is just like completing little objectives. And I got enough of those that I could just pay for the character boost without actually paying for it. And then over the course of the 80 or so hours, I got enough to do a second one, which is necessary for like the single mutually exclusive achievement this game has for some reason. One of the campaigns which we're about to talk about, which is the Settlers versus the Raiders, or like the Wastelanders one, there's an option towards the end of that quest line to side with one side or the other, and it leads to a mutually exclusive achievement. So I'm going to use that second character boost this time around to eventually go grab that other achievement on the other side of it via that second character. Just wanted to point out how kind of odd that was. Nonetheless, though, from here, let's go ahead and talk about the various main campaigns, if you will. Now, this game is interesting in the sense that it had its base campaign, if you will, which was back when the game didn't have any NPCs or anything. And so this one is told through robots and notes and environmental storytelling for the most part. It's like the main thing around the Scorched Plague and everything that is pretty much old news these days. Then you have stuff like the Wastelanders update, which brought in a sort of introductory quest, which, by the way, I do wish they would kind of mark a little better as like a good starting point, because that quest takes you around more or less the starting area called the Forest and gives you a good quest line to follow while also filling out the basics and getting you up to speed with some of the basic gameplay mechanics. If anything, I think it's probably the closest this game is going to get to a proper tutorial around how some of the individual systems work, and it's a pretty good place to actually start playing the game, even if the quest itself isn't like super long or involved or anything. You basically just help some people who have moved in with some of their problems, leading you ultimately to like a hidden stash. That was then followed on by the Brotherhood of Steel, and then there are others these days like the Expeditions, the Skyline Valley one, which was really good, and then some of the various smaller updates that have brought new content like Burning Springs, which brought a whole new area, which, by the way, I've got to say, they said that was going to take place in an irradiated hellscape that is Ohio these days, but I went there and I'm pretty sure that's just Ohio. I don't know that they changed anything at all. Very confusing. But to go into a few more specifics there, I will say, while you don't really get the full experience of there being nobody around and you coming out of the vault, the base game main campaign is still probably the most fleshed out in terms of interesting background, so to speak. So for those who don't know, Fallout 76 takes place, I believe it's 25 years after the bombs dropped, so not all that long ago. And in fact, your job from Vault 76 is to repopulate the wasteland and hopefully make it a better place to start rebuilding society. But with the recentness of the Great War, there are a lot of especially potent mutations and things that didn't have the ability to survive long term, but are a menace in the here and now, which is how you get things like the unique cryptid mutations, I think even the mutation system itself, which we'll talk about, but that's kind of the setup. And then, of course, you come out of the vault. Initially, you would have found that people like the responders and stuff had died out, but these days there's just like actually people there. But along that main campaign, you mostly learn about the Scorched Plague and how everybody reacted to it. You see, one of the other things that was going on in this area of Appalachia is that they had developed a new mining technique using nukes that would basically create a new material called ultracite. Ultracite wound up being something of interest to things like the Scorch Beast. The Scorch Beasts themselves, I believe, were created by the Enclave. And by the way, feel free to correct me on any of this. This is just from what I understand. I am not saying that this is like absolutely 100% what happened, but my understanding of this is that the Enclave was doing experiments here which created the Scorch Beast, which themselves are somehow related to this ultracite material, as you basically only find them where it is. On top of that, it seems like the Queen, which you wind up killing by dropping a nuke and luring it out, was the only one that could reproduce other Scorch Beasts. All of them, however, all of the Scorched, that is, are a hive mind that was being controlled here, and so with you killing the Queen and also the one that could reproduce, it slowly dies out, and thanks to their need of ultracite, which was only found around this area as well, it never really breaks containment into the wider wasteland, which is why we don't see this stuff anywhere else. And the main story is about you discovering all of that, finding a way to inoculate people against the Scorched Plague, and also making sure it can no longer spread. And to their credit, going through like the logs and learning about how all the different factions fought against this before ultimately being wiped out and new people moving in via all the updates was pretty interesting. I think it's probably where the game is at its strongest in terms of storytelling, and it was a good time. Now, on the other side of that, outside of the Wayward, the Wastelanders brought the Raiders and the Settlers into town. These guys are both after a vault full of gold, the sort of new Fort Knox, if you will, and the idea here is that you're going to help one of them eventually help you to get that gold and, of course, align your reputation with them. This is the part that's super grindy because while you get a ton of rep while you do the quests and stuff for them, you can ultimately only choose one to actually raid the vault with, which leads to that mutually exclusive achievement. But after you're done, you still have a ton of rep to grind, and it looks like there are only very few ways to grind it, and it just takes an extremely long time to do. The heist itself was okay, but it was very standard like heist stuff. Build a team, do the heist. There's some interesting reveals along the way, but very standard as far as that stuff goes. Then we have the Brotherhood of Steel. I enjoyed this one personally just because I like the Brotherhood of Steel. As a story, I think it was fine. You wind up joining the Brotherhood of Steel after they move back into the area. And there's a conflict between Paladin Romani and the Knight Shin guy, and you ultimately have to choose between them while also getting to the bottom of some of the super mutant expansion that has been happening. Because while initially, apparently West Tech infected some town, I think it was Huntersville, with FEV, which turned them all into super mutants, it seems like there's been more of them lately. And that winds up being the result of a bunch of experiments that the, let's say, dubious testing that was, let's say, verified poorly by the scientists doing it led to all these different creations, and you kind of get into the bottom of that and basically teach them how they were wrong, which is why we still have super mutants. The fight at the end of it was pretty cool, but for the most part, I just like that one because I like the Brotherhood of Steel. That is admittedly on my own bias. I think it's fine otherwise. Now, I think one of the better quest lines as well was actually in Skyline Valley with the Lost. So the Lost were really interesting because they seem to basically be ghouls who were then also doubly affected by an experiment gone wrong, which added like a sort of extra layer to their already deteriorating senses, and you wind up coming into contact with the sort of main one, the guy that caused it all, a dude named Hugo in the vault there, who is technically speaking blind, but seems to be all right. And I actually don't want to spoil this one too much. I thought it was pretty neat. One of the better sort of main campaign stories. Then there was all of things like the expeditions that were added, the Atlantic City one and the Pit. Atlantic City has a little story quest line in addition to the expeditions part of it. The expeditions themselves are like those little mini dungeons you can jump into, which can also be done solo, by the way, and you get rewards for completing them, the usual stuff. And then there's other things that have been added, like the recent Burning Springs update, which has its own little systems in that part of Ohio you wind up going into instead of West Virginia, where the rest of the game is set, and getting involved with some raiders there. But you can also do a bunch of bounty hunting as well. That one was a little smaller than I expected it to be honest, but it has some events around, again, doing those bounty hunts, which brings some of the more challenging encounters. Those were actually some of the only events where I saw players actually getting killed, because everywhere else at this point, you'll just kind of smash through them just because everybody else is also really strong now, so things just kind of get deleted really quickly. So long story short, while the main story is quite good, as you would probably expect with all the updates over the years, it's gotten very fragmented and all over the place. None of this stuff really requires you to do it in any particular order. A lot of these quest lines are, for the most part, doable whenever. They even added a quest to become a ghoul at one point, which was honestly pretty neat as a concept. And the upcoming expansion is supposed to drop Raven Rock. I believe that was the one that was intended to be a sort of like prequel into Fallout 3, though that's sometime after this as well. But that's of course related to Fallout 3, and we'll see what they wind up doing with it. But overall, I would describe it as a mixed bag. Some of it's perfectly fine, some of it's kind of bleh. But the main story around the Scorched Plague and all the work that went into that was pretty compelling stuff. Now, I will say, on top of all of that, one thing that kind of gets me about this game is the tone always feels a little bit off to me in places. Fallout has definitely always had that sort of, let's say, dark sense of humor, but here in Fallout 76, they tend to lean into the sort of wacky and zany side of it frequently, and it's a mixed bag. Some of it I think fits, like the cryptid stuff, but other parts of it just don't sit well with me. But at the end of the day, they're there because it's fun and it's a multiplayer game and they want people to have fun playing it together ultimately, but that also sort of takes away some of the narrative weight, which gets into like the single player versus multiplayer thing again, and I don't really want to rehash that. But I will say the thing that gets me is dropping the nukes. So as part of like the main campaign, if you will, you can, and kind of need to really, eventually get a nuke set off on the prime fissure site where the Scorchbeast Queen will then be summoned and fight it to sort of cut off the head of the plague. That's kind of where the main story ended previously. In order to do that, you have to do a bunch of work, meet with the, what's left of the Enclave anyway. At least here, that is, do a bunch of the work to actually get the silos up and running so you can then set off said nuke. And that works perfectly well that one time. You need to set off that nuke to lure the queen out in order to cut the head off of this plague. It's a sort of necessary evil situation that I actually enjoy as a narrative choice, because obviously that's not something you should really want to do, but it is necessary to end this very real threat of this plague. Almost like, cutting off an arm before an infection can spread, that kind of thing. And that works great the one time, but the problem is they keep dropping, oftentimes having nothing to do with that. And this even comes into play later where you have to nuke a mine to get it open in order to go fight an enemy down there. And it's just kind of silly, I guess, in a way that, I don't know, just kind of takes away the weight of what is supposed to be this big, gigantic thing, both in the real world, obviously, but also even in the context of this game. And while at the end of the day, it is what it is, I just don't love that personally. Now, from there, let's move on a little bit to character building, if you will. So, character building comes in a few, I would say, unique ways to this game, but should feel relatively familiar to you. There is a cosmetic character creation. This is basically Fallout 4's character creator. You can actually wind up changing this from the menu basically whenever you want after character creation, so you're not bound to it in any way. And the rest of character building is really down to progression itself. Now, you're first going to pick your special attributes. These are, of course, your individual attributes, but they work a little bit differently here in the sense that the maximum is 15, and as you add points to them until you get to level 50, you increase your perk points for that particular attribute, which are connected to a bunch of perk cards. These perk cards determine, of course, the perks you get from that attribute and the effect they have on you, like reducing the weight of items, all sorts of various combat effects, increasing your usefulness in VATs, etc., etc. Now, every time you level, you get to pick one of those cards for free, and then every 5 levels, you get a pack of cards to unlock, which gives you a random assortment. And so over time, you eventually build up a solid pool of the cards, and you can use them as you please, swap them out, etc. There's eventually a way to give yourself a separate loadout to change and adjust as you please as well. Now, another thing about perks is that you can rank some of them up. Each of them has a star rating, and you can basically use duplicates of the same perk in order to get greater effects out of them at the cost of increasing their cost in terms of your special points. Now, you can also scrap these extra perk cards, and you're going to do that to gather up perk coins, because after level 50, you start earning legendary perks every so often. You can pick these from a pool, and you get one at 50, 75, and 100, and then it starts increasing, like the next one comes at 150, and you can spend those perk coins on increasing the effect from these legendary perks as well, which is another form of long-term progression here. And I will say, I eventually came around on it, but it's another thing where, especially at the beginning of the game, it doesn't feel great. As you're both trying to get the cards themselves, you actually want to use, which takes a long time, but then they're also gated individually by attribute, and it just takes some getting used to. I did eventually get used to it though, and actually wound up kind of enjoying it, especially once you get to the late game, where I think having the appropriate attribute directly confine your perks to that makes you feel a little more constrained in a way that I think helps make unique character builds, so to speak. But at the same time, Fallout 76 isn't a game that really leans into that either, as despite being able to group up, there's not that holy trinity of MMO roles of tank, healer, etc. You don't need to do that. Everybody can basically do everything in terms of healing and DPS, etc. So it kind of becomes this awkward thing where I actually did wind up coming to enjoy the system itself, and yet the system itself doesn't give you gameplay reasons to fully dive into what should be possible there either, it felt like, with I would say perhaps the most unique thing being that becoming a ghoul would give you some perks that you can only have if you are a ghoul, that kind of thing. So that was just kind of odd overall. But then, of course, there's your gear. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't like this, and I did not ever really come around on this part, which is the gear itself, because while crafting is a big part of this game, rebuilding the wasteland is a big part of it, or at least was, and that is sort of represented by the way you get your gear, and the way it gets modded out, again, very similar to the way Fallout 4's weapon mod system worked, where you would get supplies and everything and then mod out your weapons, and that is present here. But the issue that I have with it, so to speak, is that in order to learn the mods in this game, you have to first break down that weapon type. And in order to break down that weapon type, you have to get that weapon type. And so what winds up happening is that you have to destroy a bunch of the weapon you would eventually like to use to get the mods to turn a version of it into the version of it you actually want. Now, the good news is that while there are various levels to each individual item up to 50, which have different like strength ranges, other than that, you can pretty much mod them once you have those mods to your heart content, as long as you have the supplies, which then allows you to create the exact version of that weapon you want, including legendary modifiers. So much like Fallout 4, we have those legendary modifiers, and while you can add them at random at first, there's also a vendor that you can bring a resource you'll get just by playing the game called Legendary Script to buy like individual legendary things, and then you can eventually craft those as well to put the exact legendary modifiers you want on something. And while it is very time intensive, that's kind of the in-game grind where I got to, which is where I'm kind of done all the content and I'm at the point where I'm just fine-tuning exactly what my gear looks like, utilizing that system. And while it's fine once you get to that point, especially starting out, it just kind of feels bad to constantly be destroying weapons you would kind of like to use, but would be kind of useless if you did use them because they're worse than what you have because you don't have the mods to make it what you want. Now, I also understand that because of the way the multiplayer and stuff works here, they kind of have to do that in order to stop things from being completely overpowered, but also give you something to progress towards, but it's just not a change I'm wild about personally. Now, beyond that, you can also learn various other recipes and be able to build things in your camp as well, so learning recipes even beyond your gear is a big part of general progression. And then last but not least, as far as progression goes, I did want to also mention mutations. Mutations are such a fun idea that it doesn't feel like they chose to do anything with, really. So you can, by taking on radiation, potentially get mutations. These offer fun little gameplay effects. The problem with these, it's really easy to cure them on accident. You can get around this with a perk that sort of locks it in a little better and makes that less likely to happen. But these also typically come with some sort of drawback as well as a positive benefit. Like a really popular one is Marsupial, which gives you extra carry weight, lets you jump really high, but also lowers your intelligence. And for certain builds, that can be really useful. Now, these are fun, and from what I understand, there are also consumable items you can get that will just straight up give you these. And that's a way you can keep these mutations a little more reliably, but I do kind of wish they had, again, just leaned into this more. It's a really cool idea. And to be honest with you, it reminds me a lot of the flaw system from both the Outer Worlds games. And in that sense, I would love to see them really lean into this and make it like a whole thing, as it would be one of the ways you could vary up your build and do some really fun stuff. But as of right now, most of the mutations are fine. There's a couple of them that are really interesting, but as a whole, the system felt like they could just do more with it than is being done, to be honest. That finally, though, brings us to the gameplay and world of Fallout 76. Now, gameplay-wise, it's relatively easy to describe, but we'll get into some specifics still, and this is essentially because it's Fallout 4, but multiplayer. That's kind of the gist of it, really. The most basic explanation possible, but also the most accurate one, because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they built on Fallout 4 to make this game, and so a lot of it naturally then plays and feels very much the same. Now, there are still some pretty big differences, starting with that stash size I mentioned a bit earlier. So a lot of stuff has weight that was not in Fallout 4. This is something they iterated upon and found a balance with over time, I believe, and so it's not as bad as it used to be from what I understand, but you need a lot of materials to do all that crafting for progression and everything, and you don't really have the inventory for it, so you store this in your camp stash, which has a default amount of 1,200 pounds unless you've got Fallout First or whatever. Now, I will say this was plenty, but I am starting to reach the edge of that stash limit, and it's where I'm going to have to start, being a little more judicious with what I carry around, or pay for Fallout First if I don't want to deal with the annoyance of it. So dealing with that particular limit is, because of all the junk you're picking up and everything, probably one of the more notable changes, and while that was a little bit in Fallout 4 as well, especially if you were playing on survival in particular, it's very noteworthy here as sort of the baseline experience. On top of that, you also build your camp, your own personal bit of settlement building. You can set up a camp pretty much anywhere where somebody else's isn't already, and that's going to allow you to then build a little settlement in that area. I personally think this is cool as a concept, but I lack the creativity to make the most of it. I build super basic stuff because I'm just looking for a functional base. Now, I will say this really seems to be the spot where they're trying to get people to pay for stuff. If you look at the shop and all the stuff you can lean into, so much of it is just cosmetic stuff for building up the camp you want to make. And again, I can't be bothered with it personally. It's not my thing, but it's there if you want. On top of that, they've also added some light survival mechanics as a baseline. And what I mean by light is that you you, technically speaking, should eat and drink. From what I understand, this used to give you debuffs. Now it does not. It only gives you buffs. So you don't have to deal with this at all if you want, but you should eat and drink because you get some buffs from keeping it at reasonable levels, but it's also not something that matters if you're starving or something. Now beyond that, much of the experience is questing and exploration and then taking part in multiplayer events where you see fit. And then of course the general side quests and stuff. So the basic single player questing and exploration that you can do is very, very Fallout 4. There's the main quest I've already talked about. There's side quests to find. Some of them are really interesting. Like I thought the Mistress of Mystery one was fun, just as a sort of counterplay to Silver Shroud from Fallout 4. There was also a lot to be found in the ash heap around the mining company there and the Ultra site that they found and a lot of the goings on of the mining companies that were taking advantage of the place. And then of course the mole miner dudes. But structurally speaking, you should be familiar with this game. If you've played other Bethesda titles, you basically explore, find locations, explore those. There's a lot of environmental storytelling. These days there's actual NPCs to interact with, a couple of towns like Foundation, Crater, and Fort Atlas, and this is the part where it really does just kind of feel like a single player game with other people running around here and there, and because they keep the number of people relatively small, it never feels overwhelming, although you do have to keep in mind that, some people can loot things and then it won't be there when you go there, that kind of thing. But being set in West Virginia, it really kind of leans into the area of Appalachia, as you would probably expect. Now, that's actually where I live, just farther south. I don't live quite as north as this is. But in this zone of West Virginia, we have major different biomes, like the forest where you start out, which is relatively peaceful and safe. You've got the ash heap, the toxic valley, the savage divide, the mire, the cranberry bog, and they kind of get more dangerous as you go, and you having to manage disease and stuff as well. I will say I like what they did with diseases here. Most enemies that can give you a disease are marked as a diseased enemy with an icon and everything. And you can also pick up diseases from being in waterborne areas, that kind of stuff. And you'll have to put on a hazmat suit or a gas mask to avoid airborne stuff as well. And I kind of like what they did with that stuff. It felt pretty fun and kind of gives the world a dangerous feeling outside of course, just the monsters inhabiting it, which is noteworthy because there isn't a lot of radiation to be afraid of. There's some here and there. There's some enemies that deal with it, but it's pretty easy to avoid getting irradiated as a condition. Now, all along those zones, there's all that environmental storytelling I mentioned. A big part of this leans into the cryptids. These are particularly, from what I understand, volatile mutations that did not last much past the Fallout 76 era and past the Great War, of course, but were present here for a little while, and this takes the form of various folklore and cryptozoology, etc., to make some interesting enemies to fight, like a snallygaster or wendigos. My personal favorite was probably the sheep squatch, but that was just kind of fun in what felt like an appropriate way, even if over time it kind of loses its luster. You fight enough of these things and you're just this guy again. But there are some further adjustments to it, there's a Mothman cult who seem to be worshipping the Mothman. There's also the Eldritch Horror thing that has been present in a bunch of games, taking the form of, this time, the Interloper within Lucky Hole Mine, which is not something you can actually interact with, but you can go see it. Continuing that sort of background storyline that I don't think they'll ever lean fully into, but is one of those things you can kind of get lost in across the series, and that is to say nothing of all the various dailies and things you can get up to that are on more of the multiplayer side. So the game does have daily quests you can undertake. This is one of the primary ways to earn reputation with the raiders or the settlers, which is very slow and painful. There are also those public events, the daily ops, the expeditions, and those are the kind of things on the multiplayer side you can lean into if you just want to kind of get into the more loot grindy aspect of it and trying to, of course, farm out exactly what you want with your gear, which is where I'm at personally. But that's pretty much what I've got to say on the gameplay and world side of things specifically. Definitely better than I expected. I'm glad it didn't feel as much of an MMO as I was worried it was going to. I actually did wind up enjoying this part of it. It tends to be the thing Bethesda does well, like them or hate them. I will say I still kind of missed the sandbox elements, and I think the things they had to do to make the multiplayer parts work take away from those elements, and so what is left for somebody looking for that single player experience is mostly an inferior single player experience compared to their other work, but it adds in elements that are, I think, fun in their own right. I had a surprising amount of fun joining up in public events and blasting stuff away, even if it does feel kind of silly at times. But speaking of blasting away, let's talk a little bit about combat. Now, I honestly don't have too much to say about combat that you haven't seen on screen at this point, and I assume if you're watching this, you likely played Fallout 4 as well. And if you've played Fallout 4, you kind of know how combat works here for the most part. There's really just a couple of things to talk about in that regard, so I won't spend as long on this as I normally do. But One of those things is the changes they made to VATS. Like I mentioned, it is now just a sort of real-time thing. You bring up VATS, it gives you a % chance to hit based on the usual factors, but nothing is slowed down, and rather than having to aim or it being worried about your aim, you simply take that % chance to actually hit, and this can trigger effects via like perks and stuff to make it more interesting. And again, I wound up really liking this because I think it actually kind of helps you, especially with enemies that act more erratically, and it kind of accomplishes the point of VATS still, which is to help you aim at things on a character skill level that you don't necessarily have the player skill to manage. I wound up enjoying this a lot more than I thought I was going to, which was very nice. Now on the enemy side of things, I was, I guess not exactly surprised, but thought it was of note that a lot of the enemies you fight don't really have like big group mechanics. So whereas you might play live service or MMO games and a boss fight might have all these different mechanics you have to manage, that's not really a thing here. There are like a couple of them, like the Wendigo Colossus can do like this big shout thing which makes everybody run away in fear, but that's kind of about as complicated as it gets. Other than that, not only do they not have these mechanics, most things aren't alive long enough to use them even if they did. So outside of just like their general basic attacks they'll be using, you don't really have to worry about that side of things. Probably also worth a quick mention about the way the dynamic level scaling works here. So like many a game that Bethesda has made, Fallout 76 makes use of a scaling mechanic for the various enemies you'll be running across. Now this is a dynamic scaling, so they will kind of always be based on whatever your level is, and then that is power in relation to you. However, at the same time, most of the game is pretty easy, and then I'm at a point now where there are certain enemies that are really strong, but that's just because I haven't done that sort of final tier of grinding out like gear and everything to get to the point where I should be fighting those guys. Almost everything can still be done solo. There's again a couple of things you probably want a group for, but even stuff that feels like it's probably meant more for a group can usually be soloed, like the expeditions, the daily ops, though it's hard to get the best reward for that one without a team. So there is level scaling, and it kind of just makes sure that no matter what level you are, that you are still capable of participating in all the public events and everything that you can hop into and out of and all that. But you don't really feel that scaling, or at least I didn't, until you get like post level 100 and start getting your legendary perks going. Beyond that, it's pretty much the usual stuff, kind of boring to explain it. Armor, resistances, things like that. There's diminishing returns on your own armor in order to keep things kind of fair and you not be able to destroy absolutely everything, but that's kind of limited, as you can still kind of do that, especially when you are in power armor, of course. Power armor is super useful for some of the bigger fights. Power armor is a thing here. It's readily available. There's a bunch of new suits and skins for said power armor, which again leads into that sort of multiplayer focus side of things in terms of trying to make yourself look super cool in a way that doesn't necessarily have to be conducive to the lore, and without just unnecessarily explaining basic mechanics. Those were my own personal thoughts on the thing. Next up, how does this thing play on the Steam Deck? Fallout 76 is a game that in fact predates the Steam Deck a little bit, and perhaps unsurprisingly then, it mostly seems to run pretty well over there. Fallout 4 does. Really the only thing it got dinged for was text, having to use the keyboard pull-up, as well as smaller text in some of the menus that have a lot of text going on, which I can see how they feel about it, especially in some of the item menus. And while you certainly can't have every setting maxed out or anything, it plays perfectly well over there, has the usual things you would want, provided, of course, you have the internet connection to play it on that platform, as it is required. Next up, before we sign off on this thing, let's start talking a little bit about the future expansion. So, we don't have a ton of details on this, but this game will be getting more content, which should have been obvious as a live service title to begin with, but we also know that it is very specifically getting an expansion next year in 2027, focused around Raven Rock, specifically, and presumably at least the one in Fallout 3, as I believe it's meant to lead into Fallout 3. Kind of explaining what went on at that location before Fallout 3 takes place, I would assume. I will cover that separately in the future. Doing all this for this video kind of got me set up to do that. So that'll be nice, and then between now and then, I'll work on some of the grind stuff here and there. I'll pop into this game every once in a while to do some of that, and then hopefully finish it up completely around the time that DLC releases, until maybe they do something else with it. But given the cuts to the Fallout 76 team, it's hard to say exactly what the future for this game looks like beyond that. So I suppose that's something we shall learn together. Which then brings us to positives, negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, the setting itself, Appalachia, very, very cool. That's home to me, parts of it anyway. I love seeing what they did there, the cryptids, the exploration, the actual like main campaign, if you will, with the Scorched and the Plague and everything. That was a really enjoyable experience, surprisingly so, given everything else going on with it. The way they've implemented multiplayer is, for the most part, unobtrusive. If anything, it really only affects certain mechanics that kind of had to change to accommodate it, the exact way progression works, etc. But by and large, I would say, I think the fun that having that aspect of the game brings does outweigh kind of what they took away, but I'm always going to be more of a single player kind of guy, so still not a perfect solution by any means, which is, I would actually say, one of my more negative points. The sacrifices they had to make to the single player experience in the name of making it multiplayer are at times what makes the game feel a little weird, like all those bugs and stuff with quests that only sort of save provided you actually manage to get out of the dungeon, provided the game doesn't bug out on you in some way and you have to redo that whole quest. We don't really see sort of more traditional sandbox that we're used to with Bethesda's titles, things like that. And on top of that, while they did it sparingly, there is still some of that multiplayer grind in there. Like, just to give specific examples, I don't need to do it, but I would like to eventually grind out those reputations, mostly just so I can potentially get at some of the items there and also grab the achievements that they tied to them, if I'm being honest. And then there's also the stamps from the expeditions. I need 500 of those to get an auto axe, which is actually a weapon I both want to mess around with, and it also has an achievement tied to it, and that seems to be, outside of just getting lucky, a bit of a grind to actually obtain, which is a bit of a bummer. And then there's the sort of in-game weapon grind, which is where I'm at personally, trying to tailor gear and making the most of individual experiences. And those aren't things that I love personally, which brings me to my conclusion. I would say that Fallout 76, as somebody who doesn't love the type of game it's trying to be, is still better than I expected, because the focus on the single player parts and what they did with those aspects are enjoyable on their own, and you can do them on their own. I think most of the multiplayer stuff they added was fun, but I'm always going to be left with, as is always the case with these type of games, what about the future? Will they potentially turn this into a purely solo experience if they decide to turn the servers off one day? I certainly hope so. It would be a shame for this to become completely unavailable, the way that Bethesda has absolutely done with things like Blades and Legends, etc. And while those are mobile games, yes, I would hope for a bigger title like this that they had plans to turn it into a solo experience in the event that they no longer want to sustain it as a live service. We've seen this company deal with that, at least on a different platform. And while Legends and Blades, I think, were small enough and clearly not successful enough that there weren't exactly riots about it, I will say that I really liked Legends personally. And while I don't think this game is going anywhere in the immediate future, it's something to ask yourself about. But at the end of the day, I paid $40 for the base game, which is what the base game is now, by the way, $40 US. For that, I got about 80 hours out of this. I've hit the point at which the grind is just not something I'm super into, and I'll kind of touch base with this here and there over the time between now and the next expansion, but I, for the most part, had a pretty good time for the money spent. And while I don't love everything about it, and I would be lying if I said it was the type of game that is really for me, I am still glad that I played it and I got the sort of context that this game provides to the overall series. I'm glad I got out of my bubble a little bit and chose to approach this with an open mind. And while I, again, feel like I got my $40 worth out of it, I am still left with the question that I have to bring to every live service game, which is, will I continue to enjoy this when they continue to make changes in the future, which is just not something I can know. Until, of course, I experience it. But as for what Fallout 76 is right now and my opinions on it, that is basically all I've got for you. I hope you got something out of this. I'll touch base with it again around the time that expansion releases, but that is pretty much going to do it for now. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear what you guys think about this down in the comments section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.